Day 60. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, and her daughter just told the world something that no press release, no official statement, and no law enforcement briefing had ever put into words before. She said she cannot imagine that the person she saw in that surveillance footage is the same person her mother saw standing over her bed. Standing over her bed. Not on the porch, not at the front door, not in the hallway. In the room where an 84-year-old woman slept alone, in the dark, in the early hours of a February morning, wearing her pajamas, without her shoes, without her phone, without any way to call for help. That is the image that Savannah Guthrie put into words for the first time on March 26th, 60 days after her mother disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona, and the image has not left the people who heard it since. Police have been watching someone. They tracked him using cell phone data and traffic analysis before the surveillance footage was ever shown to the public. They served a federal warrant at the home of a local man who lives 2 miles from where Nancy Guthrie was taken. They detained people, searched properties, towed vehicles, and after 60 days, they still have not said his name. They still will not say the name of the person, or persons, they have been watching. The investigation is active, they say. The leads are being pursued, they say. And Nancy Guthrie's medication, which she requires every single day for her heart condition, has now gone unadministered for 60 days. There are things in this case that most coverage has not fully assembled, details that exist in separate reports across dozens of outlets, none of them quite placed beside each other in the right order. When you arrange them correctly, the picture that emerges is considerably more disturbing than anything in the official timeline. It is also considerably more specific than the vague assurances of progress that have been offered in the weeks since she vanished. Subscribe to Murder Mystery File and turn on notifications right now, because this case is moving in ways that are not visible in the headlines, and when it breaks, you will want to have been following every step. This channel goes inside the case, not just the press conferences. What Savannah revealed in her interview with Hoda Kotb is not simply emotional context, it is investigative context. She described the moment her family first arrived at her mother's home after Nancy was reported missing, and she described what they found there, with the kind of specificity that comes from a person who has been living inside this case for 2 months. The back doors of the house were propped open, not accidentally left ajar, not gently unlatched, but propped open in the way a door is held when something is being moved through it. Her family stood in that house and tried to make sense of it. They thought, for a brief and terrible moment, that paramedics had come in the night and taken Nancy out through the back on a stretcher. Her phone was on the table. Her purse was on the counter. Everything she would have taken with her was still there, and the back doors stood open, and there was blood on the front doorstep, and the Ring camera had been torn off the wall. That is the picture Savannah Guthrie walked into on February 1st. And then she described seeing the surveillance footage the FBI released on February 10th. The footage of the masked and armed figure approaching her mother's home in the hours before dawn, and she said the words that have not left people since. She said she cannot imagine that the person she was looking at on that screen is the same person her mother saw, standing over her bed. She said she cannot, that it is too much to bear. Those are not the words of someone who has been told her mother was taken from the front porch. Those are the words of someone who has been told, or who has reasoned through the evidence herself, that whoever entered that house went all the way inside. This is day 60. This is what 60 days looks like in the case of Nancy Guthrie, and it requires the full picture to understand where the investigation actually stands, who has been watched, what has been found, and what may have been lost because of decisions made in the first hours of this case that cannot be undone. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old, the mother of NBC Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, and has lived in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood north of Tucson, Arizona, for decades. She lives alone, uses a pacemaker, requires daily heart medication, and on her best days can walk as far as her mailbox, according to her daughter. She was last seen on the evening of January 31st, when her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni drove her home after a family dinner at her daughter Annie's house and walked her inside. Her doorbell camera went offline at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st. A motion sensor registered something at 2:12 but captured no image. Her pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple devices at 2:28. She was reported missing at noon, when she did not appear for a virtual church service at a friend's home. Investigators found her blood on the front porch, confirmed by DNA. A masked, armed figure had been captured on that doorbell camera, tampering with the lens, covering it first with a gloved hand and then with foliage pulled from a potted plant before disconnecting the device entirely. The FBI recovered the footage from residual data in Google's back-end servers because Nancy did not have an active subscription to her Nest camera service. Without that recovery, there would have been no image at all. 60 days later, the FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department described the investigation as active. The Guthrie family is offering $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI is offering $100,000 separately. No suspect has been publicly named, and the details that explain why are considerably more complicated than the official record has allowed. There is a sequence to what happened on the night of January 31st into the morning of February 1st that most coverage has described as a series of timestamps, clean and clinical and arranged in a column, as though the horror of them is contained by the formatting. 147, 212, 228. But timestamps are not a story, and the story of that night is something different. Something that requires each of those numbers to be placed inside the physical reality of a house in the dark hills north of Tucson, where an elderly woman had gone to sleep alone and where something was already in motion before she closed her eyes. Her son-in-law had walked her inside at 9:50 in the evening and watched the garage door close behind her. The neighborhood around her home sits in the foothills of the Santa Catalina Mountains, where the houses are generously spaced apart and the local ordinances restrict outdoor lighting to preserve the view of the sky, which means that the streets at 2 in the morning are dark in a way that most American neighborhoods are not, dark in a way that absorbs movement without reflecting it back to anyone who might be watching. Whoever approached that house in the hours before dawn did so in near total darkness, which raises a question that the doorbell camera footage, grainy and infrared, and recovered from a back-end server, does not fully answer. How well did that person know the property before they arrived? The answer, based on everything investigators have assembled, is that they knew it very well. Consider the specific actions captured on that footage. The person who approached the front door did not hesitate at the camera. They did not react to it with surprise, or attempt to avoid it with a turn of the head. They raised a gloved hand to the lens, covered it deliberately, and when that was insufficient, reached into a nearby planter, pulled out a piece of foliage, and pressed it against the device to block the view entirely. Those are not the movements of someone encountering an obstacle they had not anticipated. Those are the movements of someone who had already decided, before they arrived, that the camera needed to come down, and who had thought through more than one method of accomplishing that. The camera was then disconnected from the wall entirely. The footage ends, but something else may have ended before that camera went dark, something that has been reported by multiple neighbors in the Catalina foothills and confirmed by investigators who went door to door in early March, asking specific questions about a specific night. The internet service in that neighborhood experienced an outage on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Neighbors who spoke to News Nation described checking their Ring camera histories the following day and finding that the footage from that window was simply not there, logged as unavailable, as though the recording had never happened. Other neighbors confirmed to investigators that they had experienced similar service interruptions. One neighbor's Ring camera showed only silence where a night of footage should have been. The FBI opened an inquiry into that outage. Investigators were seen examining a damaged utility box near Nancy Guthrie's property, a piece of infrastructure that had been described in court filings and law enforcement communications as a possible link to the disruption in service that night. The examination of that box was confirmed by KOLD News in Tucson and by IB Times in their coverage of the 7th week of the investigation. And then there is the detail in the surveillance footage that most people, watching that grainy infrared video of a masked figure on a porch in the dark, did not notice. In one of the images released by the FBI, the person in the footage appears to have a small, antenna-like object visible in the pocket of their jacket, a protrusion that a number of analysts and viewers noted in the days after the footage was released. News Nation and ABC News both reported on the object and the questions it raised. Whether that object is a signal jamming device capable of disrupting wireless communications in a localized area has not been confirmed by the FBI or by any law enforcement agency. But a signal jammer would explain the outage. It would explain the cameras going dark. It would explain why a neighborhood full of security systems, in a high-income residential area where people take their home surveillance seriously, produced so little footage from the window of time when Nancy Guthrie was taken. If the person who approached her home that night was carrying a device designed to suppress the wireless signals that her cameras, her neighbor's cameras, and every Ring device on that street depended on to function, then what happened in the Catalina foothills on February 1st was not a crime of opportunity. It was a technical operation, planned with knowledge of the neighborhood's infrastructure, executed with equipment that most people would not know how to acquire or operate, and carried out in the kind of darkness that the Santa Catalina Mountains provide to anyone who understands how to use it. That is the picture being assembled, piece by piece, by investigators who have not yet put a name to it in public. Savannah Guthrie has a brother named Cameron. She described him in her interview with Hoda Kotb as someone who spent his career in the military and worked in intelligence, a person whose professional training gave him a framework for understanding events that most people would need time to process. She said that when she called him on the morning of February 1st, still reeling from her sister's call, still trying to understand what her mother's empty house and propped open doors and blood-stained doorstep might mean, Cameron already knew. He had already understood. Before she finished speaking, he told her, "She has been kidnapped for ransom." Savannah said she asked him, "Do you think it is because of me? Because of who I am? Because of the morning program I have co-hosted for years? Because of the salary and the visibility and the association with a network that most people in America recognize on sight?" And Cameron told her gently, with the kind of directness that comes from years of training in exactly this kind of assessment, "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but yes, maybe." She has been living with that answer for 60 days. The back doors of her mother's home were propped open when the family arrived. Nancy was not wearing shoes. Her medication, which regulates a heart that requires daily intervention to continue functioning, was still in the house. Her phone was still on the counter where she had left it. And Savannah Guthrie, standing in the home where she grew up, the home she described as hallowed ground, the place where all of her family's memories lived, looked at the open doors and the blood and the missing camera and said, out loud, to the investigators who were already there, "Something is very wrong here." She was right. And 60 days later, the full shape of how wrong becomes clearer when you look at what happened inside those walls, not just what was captured on a porch camera in the moments before it went dark. Subscribe to Murder Mystery File and share this video, because the most important information in this case is not in the official statements, and someone watching right now may be carrying a piece of it without knowing. Savannah said she cannot imagine that the figure she saw on that surveillance footage is the person her mother saw standing over her bed. She said she cannot, that it is too much. Think about what those words require to be true. They require the person who came to that house that night to have moved through it, past the front door where the blood was found, through whatever part of the house lay between the entrance and the bedroom where an 84-year-old woman slept. They require proximity that the porch footage alone does not account for. They require a confrontation that happened in the dark, in the room where Nancy Guthrie felt most safe, in the place she had lived for decades and raised her children and built the life that her daughter described as everything good and bad that their family had shared. Investigators have known the shape of that confrontation since February 1st. What they have not shared is the name of the person they believe was responsible for it. But they have been watching someone. They watched him through cell towers before they ever showed his face to the public. They watched him closely enough to sign his name on a federal warrant. And on the 60th day since Nancy Guthrie disappeared, they are still watching, still building, still refusing to say who he is. The question of why they will not name him is the question that this entire investigation turns on. And the answer requires understanding not just what the FBI has been doing in those 60 days, but what has been done to the evidence they were trying to build their case from by the man who was supposed to be helping them find her. The most revealing thing an FBI source said about this case was not released in a press conference, was not contained in a written statement, and was not the kind of language that appears in official law enforcement communications. It was said to News Nation in the second week of the investigation, when the tension between the Federal Bureau and the County Sheriff's Department had become impossible to contain behind closed doors. The source described what was happening with the physical evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home and from the area around it, evidence that the FBI had asked to receive so that it could be processed at the Bureau's National Crime Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, the facility that handles the most complex forensic work in American law enforcement, with the most advanced equipment and the most experienced analysts, and the source used two words to describe the situation: dumb and insane. The evidence, including a glove recovered near the scene and DNA samples collected from inside the house, had been sent by Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos to a private laboratory in Florida, a lab his department had a pre-existing contract with, rather than to the FBI facility that was specifically requesting them and that was specifically equipped to process them at the speed and depth that a kidnapping investigation demands. The FBI source told News Nation that the Bureau had been invited into this case at the sheriff's request, that federal agents had arrived the morning after Nancy disappeared and immediately offered every resource at their disposal, and that the routing of that evidence to Florida instead of Virginia was going to cost time that could not be recovered. The source was explicit. The FBI would have to test the evidence again after getting it back from the Florida lab, duplicating work that had already been done, running the clock forward in a case where the clock had started running the moment a pacemaker went silent at 2:28 in the morning. Sheriff Nanos denied the characterization entirely. He told News Nation that the suggestion he would tell the FBI no on anything was, in his words, crazy. He explained that his department had a long-standing relationship with the Florida laboratory, that it held all of the department's comparison evidence, including DNA markers from the family and from workers who had been at the property, and that consolidating the evidence at a single facility was a sound investigative decision. He said he had no regrets. The word he used for the criticism was crazy. The word the FBI source used for the decision was insane. What cannot be disputed is the timeline of the evidence processing. The mixed DNA sample recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, the sample that Sheriff Nanos himself said in February might belong to the suspect, arrived at a private Florida lab rather than at the FBI's facility in Quantico. The analysis that followed was conducted by a contracted laboratory that, according to CBS News, raised concerns in the early weeks about whether the sample would yield a usable profile at all, given the complexity of a mixed contribution and the condition of the material. The forensic genetic genealogy process that investigators had announced in mid-February as a promising avenue of identification was contingent on that profile being separable and sufficient, and the question of whether it was sufficient was not resolved quickly or publicly, or with the kind of clarity that would allow anyone outside the investigation to assess where things actually stood. 6 weeks passed between the announcement that forensic genealogy was being pursued and any meaningful update on its progress. The evidence that might have been processed at one of the most sophisticated forensic facilities in the world was being analyzed at a private lab in Florida, and the lead detective with the most experience in the Pima County Sheriff's Department, according to one criminal defense attorney who analyzed the case publicly on News Nation, had only 3 years of experience in that department because the veterans had left, reportedly driven out by years of conflict with the man who was now leading the most watched kidnapping case in the country. One detail reported by News Nation and attributed to a criminal defense attorney with knowledge of the case carries a particular weight when considered against the urgency of those first hours. In the early days of the search, the Pima County Sheriff's Department had access to an airplane, a search asset that could have covered the rugged terrain of the Catalina foothills and the desert surrounding it from the air. The only deputy who knew how to fly that aircraft had reportedly been reassigned to street patrol following a conflict with Nanos. The airplane was available. The terrain was waiting. The 3 hours that followed Nancy's reported disappearance, hours that former FBI agents have consistently described as the most critical window in any kidnapping case, passed without aerial search capacity because of a personnel decision that had nothing to do with finding a missing woman. Nanos said he had no regrets. Meanwhile, the FBI was working its own track, using tools that the County Sheriff's Department did not have, and making decisions that the County Sheriff's Department was not fully informed of. FBI Director Kash Patel confirmed on Fox News in the second week of the investigation that agents were looking at more than one individual as a person of interest in the disappearance. He did not name anyone. He said only that the process of elimination was underway, that agents were working to exclude people who were not involved, and that the investigation was proceeding with every resource the Bureau could bring to bear. What that meant in practice was that the FBI had been tracking individuals through cell tower data and traffic analysis before the surveillance footage was made public, building a list of people whose devices had been active in the Catalina foothills neighborhood during the window when Nancy Guthrie was taken, and moving through that list methodically, gathering information, pursuing warrants, and doing so in a way that the public would not see and that the Sheriff's Department would not always be informed of in advance. The Bureau had established a 24-hour command post in Tucson. It had sent personnel from field offices across the country. It had obtained purchasing records from Walmart covering every transaction involving the specific backpack model the suspected figure had been carrying. It had reviewed in-store surveillance footage at Tucson area Walmart locations. It had shown photographs of the suspected figure's unusual gun holster to gun shop owners across the city, asking if anyone recognized the style, the brand, or the customer who might have purchased it. None of those inquiries have produced a publicly disclosed result. And threaded through all of it, present in every search and every question and every piece of evidence that was either routed correctly or not, is a detail that has not been fully absorbed by most people who have been following this case. A detail that sits in the surveillance footage itself, and that investigators have been examining since the first week of February without ever confirming or denying what it might mean. In one of the images released by the FBI, the figure on the porch appears to have something in the pocket of their jacket, a small protrusion with a shape consistent with an antenna, the kind of external element associated with a device designed to transmit or disrupt a wireless signal. The image is imprecise and grainy, and the FBI has not confirmed that the object is what it appears to be. But the neighbors in the Catalina foothills reported service interruptions that night. Ring cameras showed gaps in their histories. A utility box near Nancy's property was found in a condition that led investigators to examine it specifically as a potential link to the outage. And the FBI confirmed in early March that it had opened an inquiry into the internet disruption that occurred in the neighborhood during the window when an 84-year-old woman was taken from her home. If those things are connected, if the person who stood on that porch in the dark was also carrying a device capable of suppressing the wireless infrastructure of an entire residential neighborhood, then the crime that was committed in the Catalina foothills on February 1st was not committed by someone who acted rashly or spontaneously, or without specific technical knowledge of how a modern home security system depends on an internet connection that can be interrupted from outside the property. It was committed by someone who had studied the neighborhood, mapped its infrastructure, and arrived with the tools to disable it. That is the person police have been watching. That is the person they have not named. There is a reason the FBI's list of persons of interest has not resolved into a single public arrest, and it is not because the Bureau has failed to identify anyone worth examining. The evidence that exists in this case, the cell data, the DNA, the purchase records, the warrant history, points toward a specific kind of investigation, one that is being built carefully and deliberately toward a conclusion that can withstand the scrutiny of a federal prosecution. But that building has been happening against a backdrop of friction and delay and contamination that no investigator would have chosen. In a case where every day of delay has a human cost measured in medication that was not taken, and a family that has been suspended between hope and grief for 2 months. If you have been following this case, and you want to understand why police still will not name the person they have been watching, subscribe to Murder Mystery File and share this video, because this channel will stay on this story through every development. Leave a comment and tell us what you think about the signal jammer theory, because people watching this have noticed things in that footage that deserve more attention than they have received. The official record of this investigation is incomplete. It always has been, and the incompleteness has a specific shape, one that begins with a piece of DNA that was routed to the wrong laboratory and ends with a former Surgeon General of the United States saying, on camera, that the crime scene that might have answered every question cannot be restored. Those two facts, the evidence that may have been delayed, and the scene that cannot be reconstituted, are the shadow that falls across everything else in this case. They are not the reason police have been watching someone without naming him, but they are the reason that when a name is finally given, the legal path from that name to a conviction will be more complicated than it would have been if the decisions of the first days had been different. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has said, more than once, that he believes investigators know why Nancy Guthrie's home was targeted. He has said this with the confidence of a man who has been close to this investigation for 60 days, who has access to information the public does not have, and who has maintained throughout that his department's handling of the case was appropriate. He said he had no regrets. He said his team worked every day and every night. He said they were getting closer. He also sent the DNA to Florida. And a former sheriff who ran the same department, who commanded its SWAT team, who went on to serve as the nation's Surgeon General, looked at the decisions that were made in the early weeks of this case and said that once a crime scene has been corrupted, that is the end of it, that you cannot reconstitute it, that the integrity of the space is gone, and that no subsequent action restores what was lost. The FBI knows who it has been watching. The sheriff says he knows why the house was targeted. Between those two pieces of knowledge and the name that Tucson has been waiting for, there is a distance that has been made longer by decisions that cannot now be reversed. And Nancy Guthrie's medication has been sitting on a counter in a house in the Catalina foothills for 60 days, waiting for the person who needs it to come home. On the morning of March 26th, nearly 8 weeks after her mother was taken, Savannah Guthrie sat across from her colleague Hoda Kotb in a television studio and did something that no amount of Instagram, videos, or written family statements had yet accomplished. She put the specific physical reality of that night into spoken words, in her own voice, with the weight of someone who had been carrying those words for 2 months and could no longer hold them without sharing them. She described the back doors. She described the blood on the front doorstep. She described the Ring camera that had been yanked from the wall. She described her family's first desperate attempt to find an innocent explanation for all of it. The stretcher theory, the paramedic theory, the story they told themselves for a few minutes before the blood and the phone and the purse. And the medication that was still sitting in the house made that story impossible to maintain. She described calling her brother Cameron and hearing him say, in the voice of a person whose career in military intelligence had given him a particular fluency with the vocabulary of targeted operations, that he was sorry, but this looked like a kidnapping for ransom, and that the most likely reason someone would come for their mother in the dark was the name that Savannah Guthrie's face carries in American households every morning. And then she said the sentence that has not left the people who heard it. She said she cannot imagine that the person she saw in that surveillance footage is the person her mother saw standing over her bed. She said she cannot, that it is too much to think about. And then she said, quietly, in the way that a person speaks when they are saying something they have already said, 10,000 times in their own mind, before they say it once out loud, I'm so sorry, Mommy. Those words, taken together, are not an emotional addendum to the factual record of this investigation. They are a piece of the factual record. They describe a crime that proceeded beyond the front porch, beyond the entryway, beyond whatever threshold separates the exterior of a house from the interior life of the person who lives in it. They describe a confrontation that happened in a bedroom, in the dark, in the room where a woman who could not walk 50 yards on her best day had gone to sleep, believing she was safe, and they come from the daughter who spent the subsequent 60 days trying to understand how someone knew to come there, and how someone managed to get inside without triggering every security system that should have registered their approach. The answer to that last question may lie in a pocket. In the images released by the FBI on February 10th, the figure on the porch is visible in the kind of detail that infrared doorbell camera footage allows, which is to say imprecise, high contrast, and sufficient for shape and movement, but not for the kind of fine resolution that lets a viewer be certain about what they are seeing. Most people who examined that footage focused on the mask, the backpack, the holster positioned unusually low on the body. A smaller number of people, including analysts who spoke to News Nation and ABC News, noticed something else, an object visible in the pocket of the figure's jacket, a protrusion with the silhouette of something that extends upward, the way an antenna extends from a device designed to transmit or intercept a signal. A signal jammer is a device that operates by broadcasting interference on the same frequencies used by wireless communication systems, overwhelming them with noise until the devices that depend on those frequencies, cameras, routers, cellular connections, Ring doorbells, the entire ecosystem of a modern home security infrastructure can no longer function. It is illegal to operate one in the United States, classified by the FCC as a prohibited device regardless of purpose or context. It is also, for anyone with the knowledge to acquire and operate one, a tool that could turn a neighborhood full of surveillance cameras into a neighborhood full of blank screens, simultaneously, at a distance, without touching a single device. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood reported an internet outage on the night of February 1st. Multiple residents confirmed service interruptions to investigators. At least one neighbor found that their Ring camera history showed no footage from that window. The recording logged as unavailable as though the signal had never reached its destination. The FBI confirmed in early March that it was actively investigating the outage and its possible connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Investigators were seen examining a damaged utility box near her property, a structure that KOLD News in Tucson confirmed was being assessed as a potential link to the disruption. If the object in that pocket is what the silhouette suggests it might be, and if that device was operating in the Catalina foothills during the hours when a woman was being taken from her home, then the person who came to that property that night arrived not merely with a mask and a backpack and a holstered firearm, but with the technical capacity to disable the neighborhood's eyes before he ever set foot on the porch. That changes the profile of this crime in a way that has not been fully absorbed by the official narrative. This was not someone who put on a ski mask and drove to a house he had seen once and hoped for the best. This was someone who knew what kind of security systems are standard in an affluent Tucson neighborhood, who understood that those systems depend on a wireless signal that can be disrupted from outside the property, who arrived carrying the means to accomplish that disruption, and who had already been to the property before, on the night of January 11th at minimum, possibly on other occasions that the footage has only partially captured. This was someone with preparation, with knowledge, and with tools. Subscribe to Murder Mystery File and share this video right now, because what we are describing is a picture of a crime that is more sophisticated and more deliberately executed than almost any coverage of this case has yet acknowledged, and the person who carried it out has been watched by the FBI for weeks without being named in public. If you are watching this in Tucson, if you knew someone in January who had knowledge of wireless jamming technology, or who asked unusual questions about the security systems in that neighborhood, call 1-800-CALL-FBI. Comment below with what you think that antenna-shaped object in the footage actually is, because this community has noticed things in that video that deserve more careful examination than they have received. Cameron Guthrie knew in the first phone call. He heard the description of the open doors and the blood and the missing camera and the medication still on the counter, and he understood immediately that what had happened to his mother was deliberate, targeted, and planned. His professional background gave him a framework for that recognition. The question that his immediate assessment raises, 60 days later, is whether the planning that he intuited in those first minutes included the technical sophistication that the signal jammer theory, if confirmed, would imply. Because a ransom kidnapping and a technically executed suppression of a neighborhood's surveillance infrastructure are not separate phenomena. They are the same operation described from two different angles. The first describes the motive, the second describes the method. And the method, if the evidence holds, was the work of someone who knew how to make an entire block go dark. That person has been watched. His name has not been given. And the distance between those two facts is the distance this investigation must still travel before Tucson gets the answer it has been waiting 60 days to hear. The clock that started at 2:28 in the morning on February 1st is still running. Here is where the investigation stands on day 60, assembled from everything that has been confirmed, everything that has been officially stated, and everything that the record makes clear without embellishment. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department continue to describe this as an active kidnapping investigation. A dedicated homicide team within the sheriff's office is working the case under the operating assumption that Nancy Guthrie is still alive, a presumption that Sheriff Nanos confirmed in recent weeks, and that the family has not publicly abandoned. Even as Savannah told Hoda Kotb that they also know Nancy may already be gone, and that they grieve and hope in the same breath, and have been doing so for 2 months. The forensic genetic genealogy processing of the mixed DNA sample recovered from inside the house continues at an undisclosed laboratory, with no confirmed timeline for results, and no public update on whether the sample has yielded the kind of usable profile that the analysis requires. The CBS News report from early in the investigation, noting that there were concerns about the quality and separability of the mixed sample, has not been revisited or resolved in any official statement. The most significant piece of biological evidence in this case remains in process, somewhere between the Florida laboratory that received it and the conclusion that investigators need it to reach. The construction workers lead that federal agents pursued in week 6 of the investigation, asking residents in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood for the names of every contractor and laborer who had been active near Nancy Guthrie's home in the weeks before February 1st, has produced no publicly disclosed result. The inquiry into the neighbor who moved out of the area before Nancy disappeared has produced no publicly disclosed result. The examination of the damaged utility box has produced no publicly disclosed result. The holster photograph that was shown to gun shop owners across Tucson has produced no publicly disclosed result. The recall effort against Sheriff Nanos launched formally on March 12th and requiring 120,000 verified signatures within 120 days, continues to gather support. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously on March 24th to compel Nanos to appear and testify under oath, invoking a territorial-era Arizona law that has rarely been used in the modern history of the state. Nanos responded to the recall effort by saying that he honors the will of the people and has no regrets. He responded to the crime scene criticism from former sheriff and former Surgeon General Richard Carmona by calling it silly. Carmona said, on the record, in words that have not been retracted or revised, that once a crime scene has been corrupted, that is the end of it, and that the decisions made in the early days of this investigation may have already changed its trajectory in ways that cannot be reversed. Two questions remain at the center of this case that no official statement has resolved. The first is the name. The FBI has been watching someone. Cell data tracked him before the public ever saw his face. A federal warrant was signed with his address on it. He was detained and questioned and released, and his attorney said he had no connection to the case. And somewhere between that release and this 60th day, the investigation has continued moving, quietly and deliberately, toward a conclusion that no one in law enforcement has yet been willing to announce. The name that Tucson has been waiting for is somewhere in the documents that the FBI has been building since February 1st. And the question is not whether it exists, but when it will be spoken aloud, and what will happen to the case that has been assembled around it. The second is the medication. Nancy Guthrie requires daily heart medication to maintain the function of a pacemaker that stopped transmitting at 2:28 in the morning 60 days ago. She is 84 years old. She cannot walk the length of her own driveway without difficulty, and the people who have her know that. They have known it for 60 days. Whether that knowledge has been used as leverage, or ignored, or accommodated in ways that investigators have not disclosed, is a question that sits beneath every other question in this case, because it is the question that has the most direct bearing on whether Nancy Guthrie is still alive. Savannah Guthrie returns to the Today Show on April 6th. She said she does not know if she will belong there anymore, but she wants to try. She said she cannot come back and pretend to be something she is not, but she also cannot stay away from the people she considers her family. She said her joy will be her protest. And somewhere in the city where she grew up, where her mother has lived for more than 50 years, where an investigation that the whole country has been watching is still building toward a name it has not yet spoken, the clock continues to run. There is something that the Nancy Guthrie case has made visible about the way homes are protected, and the way that protection can be undone, that is worth understanding regardless of how this investigation ends, because the vulnerability it exposes is not unique to one house in the Catalina foothills, and the woman who experienced it is not the only person in America who could. A modern home security system is built on assumptions. The assumption that the camera will record what it sees. The assumption that the doorbell will log who approaches. The assumption that if something goes wrong in the dark, there will be footage in the morning that tells the story of what happened. Every one of those assumptions rests on a wireless signal, and a wireless signal can be interrupted from outside a property by someone who arrives with the right equipment and the willingness to use it before they ever touch a door or a camera or a person. The footage from Nancy Guthrie's doorbell was recovered because a major technology company retained residual data in back-end servers that she did not even know existed. If Google had not held that data, if the recovery team had arrived a few days later, if the retention policy had been different, the only images from that night would have been the darkness itself. What this case teaches us about targeted abductions is something that law enforcement researchers have documented for decades, but that public discussion rarely addresses directly. The preparation phase is longer than the crime itself, and it is conducted in plain sight. The person who came to that house in the early hours of February 1st had, by the evidence investigators have assembled, visited that property before, had studied the rhythms of a neighborhood where the houses sit far apart and the streets go dark at night, and had arrived on the night he acted with tools designed to exploit the specific technological dependencies of a modern security system. He was not visible as a threat during the preparation. He was just a person in a neighborhood, moving through it the way people move through neighborhoods, until the night he was not. For anyone who cares for an elderly parent living alone, or who is that person, the practical implications of this case are specific. A security system that depends entirely on a single internet connection is a system with a single point of failure. A camera that faces only one direction covers only one angle. A neighborhood where houses are spaced far apart and exterior lighting is restricted, however beautiful that design may be, is a neighborhood where movement goes unwitnessed in ways that a more densely settled street would not allow. None of these are failures of the people who live in these places. They are conditions that a specific kind of person, with a specific kind of preparation, can learn to use. What this case also teaches us about the relationship between federal and local law enforcement is something that becomes visible only in the friction, in the moments when the two institutions are not moving in the same direction, at the same speed toward the same goal. When they work together cleanly, the public sees results. When they do not, the public sees 60 days. The question Murder Mystery File will continue to ask. Every time this case produces a new development is the same question it has asked from the beginning. What does the evidence actually show? And what has been done with it? And what does the distance between those two things tell us about where this case is going? Day 60. The investigation is active. The DNA is in process. The name is unspoken. And Nancy Guthrie, who on her best days could walk to the end of her driveway and back, has been missing for every one of those 60 days. In a case that has all the evidence of planning and none of the resolution that planning should eventually produce. Subscribe to Murder Mystery File now and turn on notifications, because this channel will be here when the name is finally spoken, when the genealogy results return, when the warrant contents become public, and when the 60 days of silence finally end. That is the commitment this channel makes to everyone who has been following this case from the beginning. The question that belongs to day 60, and to every day that follows it, is the simplest one in this entire investigation, the one that all the cell data, and federal warrants, and forensic genealogy, and signal jammer theories, and evidence routing disputes and recall efforts, and sworn testimony ultimately comes back to, where is she? Day 60. The clock started at 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, in a bedroom in the dark, and it has not stopped since.